He says that he saw a woman, he saw my wife, he saw her spirit standing in the air above me while the crew worked on my body. One of the nurses saw the same thing. My name is Jeffrey Olson. I'm a best-selling author and a near-death experiencer, and it's a pleasure to be with you today. My near-death experience was based on an automobile accident. The whole family was in the car. We'd been on a family vacation, a road trip. It was me, my wife, and our two boys. And it was the Easter weekend. We had been down to see my wife's family, her parents and her grandparents. And it was on the way home that we had the accident. And there's a couple of things that are key or that are interesting to point out. As we got ready to leave that morning, I'd put the kids in the car, everything was packed up and ready to go. We had said our goodbyes. And I was just pulling away from the curb, and my wife said, "Stop, wait." I thought she had forgotten something. But when I stopped the car, she said to me, "I just want to go say goodbye to Mom and Dad one more time." And I watched as she, jumped out of the car, and her parents were there on the porch kind of waving the way grandparents do as we drove off. But I noticed as she ran up and she not only hugged them each, but she kissed them both. And I saw that happen. Now, in that moment, it wouldn't have been that big of a deal, but in hindsight, that was the last goodbye. And the reason I bring this up is, she must have had an impression, an intuition, a whisper that said, "Go tell Mom and Dad goodbye one more time." But she acted on it. She said, "Stop the car. I need to go, say goodbye." And she did. And I noticed that. So I think that's key in life. Gosh, when we get those impressions, when we have those thoughts, those feelings, go do that. And she did. And then she came and got back in the car. And, I proceeded and got onto the interstate, and I put the car at 65, 75 miles an hour, as fast as I could legally go to get home. And we were driving up the road. Now, it's interesting because my wife had eventually laid her seat back and had gone to sleep. I was driving, and I could hear my son Spencer, my 7-year-old at the time. He was playing with action figures in the seat behind me. I was glancing in the rearview mirror to look at traffic, and I saw Griffin, my youngest son, just a toddler. He was asleep in his car seat. And it was a very peaceful drive, but I had a moment of gratitude as I did that, as I heard Spencer playing and I saw Griffin in his car seat. And there was Tamara, sound asleep with her seat laid back, but she was still holding onto my hand. And it was a moment of gratitude. It's like, wow, look at this. Look at these beautiful boys, and here's my wife, this beautiful woman that's still holding my hand. And I was aware of all that. And it was about an hour after that the accident happened. And there was reports of crosswinds, heavy crosswinds blowing. There was reports of a pickup truck that was driving erratically on the interstate. One of the most difficult things about the story is I believe what happened is I may have just dozed off at the wheel, just nodded off. And when I did that, I swerved to the right, I overcorrected to the left, and I lost control of the car. And the car began to roll, not off the road, but down the road, at that high speed of 70 miles an hour. And it was a horrific automobile accident. I lost consciousness, as the car was rolling. I blacked out. I knew we were crashing, but it's like I blacked out. But when the car came to a stop, I was completely conscious. I was completely aware of what was going on. The first thing I heard was my 7-year-old son in the back seat crying hysterically. And as a father, I thought, I've got to get to him. I've got to get to my boy. But that's when I realized that I couldn't move. I was I was pinned to the floorboard or the seat. I couldn't tell. There was all the broken glass. There was the rancid smell of gasoline. I was unaware of my injuries. I was severely injured. What had happened to me is both of my legs had been crushed and shattered. My left leg was eventually amputated above the knee. My back had been damaged. My rib cage was damaged. My lungs were collapsing. My right arm had almost been completely torn off, and then the seatbelt had cut through and ruptured all my intestines. It was torn open, clear through the hip. I was a mess physically. I was unaware of the injuries. All I knew was I heard my son crying, but that's when I realized that no one else was crying. And I became aware of the scene of the accident. I knew in that moment that both Tamara, my wife, and my youngest son, Griffin, were gone. They were killed instantly in the accident. And I won't get into what I saw or what I experienced, but I knew. And that was the darkest moment a man could ever be in. I mean, here I was with a hysterical child. I can't get to him. I'm losing consciousness. Half the family has passed away, and I was driving the car. I mean, it was the regret, the guilt. It's like, what happened? How, I wanted those 3 seconds back. What happened? And it was in that dark moment, it was in that panic and that horror that the near-death experience began to unfold. As I was there in that horrible moment, I lost consciousness, but I felt light come. It's as if light, I felt light come and surround me, almost like it was comforting me, like a blanket. It was tangible. I felt light come, and it felt as if I was rising above the accident scene. And suddenly I could breathe. The pain was gone. In fact, I wondered, how can I be okay? But I felt great. I felt very much alive. And yet what was happening is my soul was leaving my body, if you will. But here I was in this light, very conscious, very aware. And as I was in that light, my wife, who I knew was deceased at the scene, I knew she was gone. Suddenly she was there in that light with me. And she didn't have injuries. She was gorgeous. She was radiant. She was beautiful. And yet she was there, but she was emphatic. She kept saying, "Jeff, you can't stay. You can't stay. You've got to go back. You've got to go back." And we literally had this conversation about, if I stayed with her, our oldest son would be orphaned. And, he was only 7 years old at the time. And we had this, we made a deal. I agreed to come back. Now, somehow she knew she couldn't come back, but she was emphatic that I come back and that I couldn't be there. I couldn't stay there. And that was an interesting, conversation and choice. I didn't have to figure out how to come back. Once I made the decision, it was almost like, like I was whisked away, and here I was moving about a very busy level 1 trauma center, an emergency room hospital. And I have no concept of time in this light, in this experience. What I later found out is that people arrived at the scene, emergency equipment was called. My son Spencer was banged up a little bit, but he basically walked away from the accident. I had to be extricated from the car. The extent of my injuries caused that I had to be life flighted or airlifted to the nearest level 1 trauma center. I was unaware of any of that. All I knew is I'd crashed the car. I had said this profound goodbye and made this choice to come back. And here I was moving about the hospital, the trauma center, and It's like I had 360-degree awareness. I was aware of the doctors and the nurses and even other patients in the hospital, other family members, everyone I saw, everyone I encountered. And it's as if I could encounter, all of it at once. But I knew them individually. I knew them. I knew their love. I knew their hate. I knew their motivations, their challenges, their joy, their thoughts. I was, for example, I passed a nurse in the hallway, and she was completely unaware of me. Now, keep in mind, this is my soul. This is my spirit moving about the hospital. But as this nurse passed, I knew everything about her. I knew her life. It's like she was me and I was her. There was a oneness. There was a connection, not only to her, but to everyone. And I felt the abuse that she had received as a child. I was aware of it. It's almost as if I experienced it myself. And yet in that same moment, I saw the magnificence of who she was. Wow, and here she is serving and helping and healing in a hospital. And everyone I saw them in this divine essence. I saw the magnificence of who they are. And I was having this profound experience as I moved about the hospital until I came upon a body or a man that I didn't feel that from. So I thought that was odd. And that's when I stepped closer to take a look, and I realized, oh my goodness, that's me. But it wasn't me. I was having this profound connected experience, but there was my body. And that's when the reality hit that, wow, I'm not in my body. This experience is, outside of my body. And it was sad. I had a sadness. My body was so broken. I mean, the injuries were so extensive. And there I was looking at myself, my body, and knowing I had to get back in. But I had this reverence. It's like, wow, I never realized. I took for granted the miracle machine our bodies are. I mean, I didn't have to remind my heart to beat or think about my lungs breathing. I had this realization that, wow, our bodies are such miracles, so miraculous, and mine was so broken, and I knew I had to get in. And we have no idea how powerful our thoughts are. It's just like when I made the choice to come back, like now I had to get back in the body, but I didn't have to figure out how. As soon as I had the thought, the intention, I'm going back in the body, boom, then I was back in the body. But back to the pain and the trauma and the grief and the regret. And it was horrible. I mean, there was a big tube, down my throat, a ventilator doing the breathing for my lungs since they had been so damaged. And my legs were obviously immobile, having been crushed. My right arm was immobile because it had been almost torn off. And they eventually tied down my left hand because I kept grabbing at all the medical equipment. And the hospital was it was a long and extensive experience. I learned a lot. I was in the hospital for 5 months. I had 18 surgeries in total putting me together. There was horrible infections. I threw pulmonary emboli, the blood clots that lodge in your lungs, not one, but 2 of them. I mean, I really should not have survived, but I'd made this deal. That I would come back and raise, our son. And my family was fantastic. My brothers had stepped in, and they took Spencer, my oldest son. They just took him into their home and took care of him just like he was one of their own while I was in the hospital. But there was a significant thing that happened in the hospital. And 2 of the medical staff, as I was life flighted in, and as the emergency crews and the surgeons and specialists and doctors were working on me, 2 of the members of that medical team had a profound experience which they shared and talked about. In fact, Dr. Jeff O'Driscoll has written a book about his experiences in the ER. But what he recounts is, as the team was working on me, addressing all of my injuries, he came into that operating room, that emergency room, And he says that he saw a woman, he saw my wife, he saw her spirit standing in the air above me while the crew worked on my body. One of the nurses saw the same thing. And the doctor was very aware. He's very gifted this way. He had had this happen in other circumstances where he'd seen spirits or souls in the ER, but here was my wife, and he knew that was my wife. He had never met her. We were strangers to him. But as he recounted to me, he said she communicated with him. And I said, what did she say? And he said, she simply thanked us for all we were doing to save your life. And I burst into tears and said, of course she did. And yet it made so much sense. The doctor had no idea, that I had made this deal, that I had had the experience. He didn't know me at all. But when he shared that, and this was months later, this was, when I was well enough that he could come and see me, and I was coherent enough that I could speak with him. I was in ICU for, weeks. And this was after I'd been, moved from ICU to surgical recovery. But we became friends. When he told me what he had experienced, he had no idea what I had been experiencing, but I was able to tell him. I was like, wow, this happened to me. And I was comforted that I could tell a doctor. I mean, I thought if I'm crazy, he will get me the psychiatric assistance I need, but he didn't doubt or question because he had had this experience. And Dr. Raymond Moody, who has coined the phrase near-death experience, when he heard about this and was able to talk to me and to Jeff O'Driscoll, to the medical staff, he said, this is one of the most profound evidences that there is life after death, that there is something after the soul leaves the body. But I wanted to share that because that was unique and somewhat significant. Some people say, well, the near-death experience is, that the brain is losing oxygen, it's a hallucination. But the doctor and the nurse weren't losing oxygen. They were completely healthy, completely conscious, and they had a profound experience at the same time I was having my profound experience. And it's not that I needed validation. I knew what I experienced was real to me, but it was interesting to have medical staff involved as well. And perhaps one of the most profound experiences was at the end of my hospital stay. And it's worth pointing out, I mean, the profound things that happened for me, one was at the scene of the accident. I mean, this first experience was at the scene of the accident. Before, morphine and narcotics had been administered, the hospital stay was long, and I was on a lot of narcotics, especially at first as they were trying to deal with all my injuries. But this next experience was at the end of my hospital stay. I was off of any of the heavy narcotics. I was just a week or so from coming home. I was out of ICU. I was out of surgical recovery. I was actually in the rehabilitation wing. And I was still very sick. I was still quite ill. I mean, my right leg was in a brace, because they'd had to rebuild the right knee. My left leg was amputated off. I had a colostomy bag that was dealing with the ruptured intestines. This arm was all up in a sling. I mean, I was really, all I could do was use my one hand. And I had laid on my back so long that I'd rubbed all the hair off the back of my head. I was bald on the back of my head because I'd laid in that hospital bed for months. But I was getting better. I was healing. I was going to be going home. And that's when this next experience happened. I was able to finally lay on my side, which was my natural way of sleeping. And I fell into a deep sleep. And yet in that sleep, I was aware that I was sleeping. I'm like, wow, I'm really in a peaceful sleep. And as I had that thought, this light came. The same light as at the accident scene. I felt this light come and surround me. I was grieving so miserably. I was grieving the loss of half the family and my child and my wife. And this light came and began to comfort me in my grief. And once again, it felt like I was rising up, like I rose above the hospital bed. But this time the light it dispensed. Once I felt this rise, the light went away, and I was in the most beautiful place. People use words like heaven or the spirit world or the other side. The only word that comes close to what I was experiencing is I was home. I was home and I was whole. I didn't have the injuries. I had both legs and both feet, and I was healthy and I was whole, and I felt so welcomed, so familiar. I was home, and I began to run. I began to run. And it was such a physical experience. This is what I could feel the energy of the ground beneath my feet. I could feel the intelligence of gosh, the thighs and the calves as I ran. It was a very it was a physical experience, even though I was out of the body. This was my spirit again, but I was running and joyfully experiencing being home. And as I was doing that, I did have the knowing. It was as if I knew I'm not here to stay. And about that time, there was this corridor off to my left, and I knew intuitively I'm to go down that way. So I did. I began to work my way down the corridor. And as I did, there was a crib, a child's crib at the end of the corridor. Now, Griffin, my youngest son, at the time of his passing, he was only 14 months. He was a toddler, and he was still sleeping in a crib at home. So I was very intrigued by this crib. I made my way to the crib, and I looked in it, and there was my little boy. There was my Griffin, sleeping as peacefully as he was when I glanced in the rearview mirror of the car. And as a father, I swept him up. I picked him up, and this was physical too. I don't know if you've ever picked up a sleeping child, but there's a heat and a weight to it. I swept him up and I held him in my arms, and he was solid against me. And I was actually having the thought, how can this be? How can this be so physical? And as I held him against me and I could feel him breathing. I could feel his breath on my neck. I leaned over and I even smelled his hair. All of the senses were very much alive. The touch, the smell, the sight, the hearing, all of it was very much alive. And as I smelled his hair, and I don't know if you've smelled the hair of a loved one, like it was familiar. I'm like, this is my boy. It was familiar. This is him. I'm holding my child. And I began to cry. I began to weep, thinking, here I'm holding him. And as this was happening, suddenly there was this profound presence behind me. There was this overwhelming, cosmic, wise, powerful presence. It was, as I was holding him, it was coming closer and closer. And I thought, oh my goodness, that's God. I'd grown up in a religious home, and I thought, that's God. And I began to have feelings of guilt. I thought, my little boy is here because I crashed the car. His life has been cut short because I lost control, and this presence is coming closer and closer, and I'm holding my child, and I'm feeling all the regret of what had happened, and this presence came right behind me, and I was fearful. I had the thought, I hope I can be forgiven, as I'm holding my little boy, and it was in that thought that, and this almost felt physical too, these divine arms just came and held me and my little boy, and suddenly there was so much love. This thought of, I hope I can be forgiven, the first communication, and it wasn't with words, it was just this flowing into me, was, there's nothing to forgive. Everything's in divine order. And I'm weeping, and I'm saying, how can that be? And then I saw my life. It was the light. I saw my life, as I'm asking, how could things be in divine order? And I began to see things in my life. And I would say, well, that was a mistake. I didn't mean to do that. And the beautiful being that held me, the divine God, whatever word anyone wants to use for it, as I was looking at my life and saying, well, that was a mistake, it was communicated there are no mistakes. What did you learn? I was being asked the question, what did you learn? There was so much love. There was no judgment. I even saw things, I said, well, that was wrong. I knew it was wrong. I did it anyway. And this beautiful presence, this being, God that held me said, that's your judgment of it, not ours. We love you. You are as precious and as beloved and as perfect as the child you hold. And it was multiplied, because here I am holding my son, who I love, who I adore, who is perfect to me, who is beloved to me. And the divine being is communicating to me, that's how loved you are. Even more so, you are our child. And it was a very personal experience, but at the same time, I knew it rippled out to every living soul. Every one of us is so loved, so unique, so precious. And it felt as if the entire universe, all there is, was watching this, was there present with me as I held my son, as I was held in the arms of God, and as this communicated, and I saw life differently. And I was taught about choice. As I held my son, I was told, you can be mad at God your whole life because this accident happened, because it was allowed to happen. And that was a choice. Or I could beat myself up. I could feel guilty and hate myself my whole life because I was driving the car. But then I was told there was another choice, that I could choose to give my son, to let him go, to trust and hand him over. And it wouldn't feel as if he was ripped away from me, that I could exercise my will. And this was the interesting communication. I mean, I'm told, here's this divine being saying, you can exercise your will. And I said, no. I mean, from the time I was a child, I was taught it's God's will. It's your will be done, not mine. And what was communicated is God said, your will is my will. That's how much you're loved. My will is that you have free will, that you get to choose, that you get to be a sovereign being. And I'm giving you the opportunity to hand your son over and exercise your will in this matter. And in all that love, and in all that peace, and in all that beauty, and in all that connection, I was able to kiss my little boy, and I gave him back. I gave him to God. And then, then I'm back in the hospital bed, to the injuries, to the all that was going on, but with some different perspective. Now, I grieved as miserably as a man grieves, I mean, I don't want anyone to think that I had this horrible accident and I had this profound near-death experience and then I was okay. We had the accident. Half the family was lost. I did have profound out-of-body and near-death experiences, but I grieved. I grieved for years. I still cry. I still grieve. It's been 26 years since that happened. I've gone gray and become an older man, and yet I still grieve. But there was a deeper knowing about all of it. That death is not the end. When I left my body, I was very much alive. I was very much alive, experiencing even all the physical senses. I learned that there's so much love